Thanks to all of you for coming out on this weeknight. As Blake said, I'm with Point Blue Conservation Science, and I hope it's okay that I kind of broadened my focus a little bit tonight to talk about not just snowy plovers, but ecology of shorebirds, other shorebirds as well on Pacific Coast sandy beaches. It's the habitat upon which snowy plovers rely, and so it's just interesting to think about the ecosystem itself as well, as in addition to the species. Can everybody hear me? Do I need to project a little more? Okay. I usually get in trouble for being too loud, so. So first, just to tell you a little bit about Point Blue, you can see our mission statement here. I'll just read it. We conserve birds, other wildlife, and ecosystems through science, partnerships, and outreach. Point Blue's 160 scientists develop nature-based solutions to climate change, habitat loss, and other environmental threats that benefit people and wildlife. And you can sort of read the other bullets there. We are increasingly working to kind of stand in this space between climate adaptation and ecosystem protection. We want to make sure that climate adaptation projects are fulfilling the goal of providing habitat for wildlife well into the future. And then before I talk about shorebirds and snowy plovers, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. This is my story. I study birds because of a plant. I study birds because of a plant. I grew up in Southern California and went to those beaches which were covered with ice plant, and I never saw a real native dune plant until I came to UC Santa Cruz as an undergraduate. And I was able to go out to Wilder Ranch State Beach, which is closed. I was there on doing research. And I saw this beach morning glory, which I thought was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Incredibly delicate in this incredibly harsh environment. And immediately I was hooked and much more interested in beaches than I ever had been before in my life. More on that later. Just a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about tonight. As I mentioned, I want to talk about sandy beach ecology a little bit because it's so integral to understanding the snowy plover and its adaptations, but also a little bit about a little intro on that, other shorebirds on sandy beaches. And then I'll talk specifically about snowy plovers. And so some of the key things about sandy beach ecology. A lot of people think of sandy beaches as strictly a place to recreate. There's a lot of ecosystem dynamics going on out there. Sandy beaches are sort of mediated by natural disturbance, and this is true for dunes and for the beaches themselves. And that means that all the features that you see are caused by natural disturbance from wind and waves and deposition of debris. And the dunes themselves, of course, are built by sediments coming from the marine system and up onto land. This environment in Monterey Bay is heavily impacted by humans as it is throughout the Pacific coast. And this is a really interesting infographic that is from a scientific paper, but here's some of the key features, and you guys can see the writing there. It's characterized by a geometry that it's a linear system with a high edge to area ratio. So it's got a long linear kind of shape with lots of boundaries, so it's defined essentially by boundaries. It's a malleable dynamic habitat, and so it's composed of all this unconsolidated sand, and sort of this dynamism and instability are the norm. And because of this long narrowness, there are linkages where there are substantial exchanges of matter, organisms, and nutrients. And then we're located at the terrestrial and marine interface, so there's a high interchange of materials from the marine to the terrestrial ecosystem. And those things are really key to understand. And I sort of think of it in the conservation world a little bit as the redheaded stepchild, which is if you're in conservation, there's the terrestrial system and then there's the marine system. And the coastal system sort of is neither here nor there, and there's some challenges associated with that. So one of the key things about the sandy beach ecosystem that's so important for shorebirds, and especially for the plovers of the shorebird world, is this macroalgal rack. So macroalgae are the giant algae that we have growing out in the nearshore environment. There's two species you're going to be really familiar with. This is a giant kelp. This is the one that has all these small little fronds and bladder pods, but grows quite large. And the amazing thing about this macroalgal rack is that we have this whole consumer ecosystem of these small amphipods that break down this macroalgal rack. And you might think, where does all the seaweed go? It's actually broken down by these little individual consumers. So that's one of our main species, and there's an example of a teluchrid amphipod breaking down, grazing essentially on rack. And then these amphipods become food, especially for plovers. Our other major species is bull kelp, and this is probably the one you're really familiar with. You see it all over the beach, and it looks like a long bullwhip. And we have the same sort of system that goes on here. You can see that's the end of the bull kelp, and it's covered with amphipods, which becomes food for plovers. And then also becomes, when it's dried, nesting sites for snowy plovers as well. They love to nest in the little dried fronds of the bull kelp. More on snowy plovers in a minute. And so these fauna, which are on the surface, so they're epifauna, they're prey for predatory shorebirds, especially, as I mentioned, plovers, turnstones. And there's just another example of the food that they're eating. That's already turnstone. And then for the other sort of group of shorebirds, they're mostly eating benthic fauna, things like sand crabs, which you can see here, and that's a marble godwit eating sand crabs. But still, these nutrients inform this whole nearshore environment. And so some of the main threats to sandy beaches are anything that disrupts a natural process or an ecological function. So any way in which we manage sediment, whether that is removing it to the system or even adding it to a beach. Beach nourishment is really common in Southern California, and it has really negative ecological impacts. It's likely to be a really important strategy for coastal adaptation for beaches. So it's good to know that it's not 100% a positive thing. Coastal armoring, of course, which just will result in beaches ceasing to exist. Mining, which we have a history of in this area. High impact recreation, things like beach driving, horses on beaches, and then of course beach grooming, which we don't have a lot of in Monterey Bay, but is pretty common in regions south of here. And then of course the big one on the horizon is climate change with warmer oceans, of course rising seas, and then ocean acidification, which will profoundly, potentially affect all the soft-shelled organisms that the larger shorebirds rely on. And so just really quickly, what happens when rack is absent from beaches? This is a pretty well-documented phenomenon. So the species richness of prey declines because they're so dependent on rack, and the abundance of shorebirds also plummets. And there's just a couple figures here to show you this. This is from a paper that Jenny Dugan of UC Santa Barbara published. It's a long time ago, but these patterns have held pretty strongly in all the work that has been conducted since. So what we're looking at is that the number of faunal species and how that relates to the standing crop of rack. So you can see that on green beaches you have the lowest number of animal species living on the beach. And then similarly with shorebird abundance, you can see that the more rack that is present, the higher number of shorebirds you have. And these patterns are pretty consistent. So just to wrap up the sandy beach part here, the kelp rack inputs are really important and they drive the food web. And this affects the distribution and abundance of shorebirds. Any disruptions in the food web or the physical environment can have negative impacts on shorebirds, including snowy plovers. And I just wanted to, since I know a lot of people who are interested in birds, I just wanted to kind of really quickly go over some of the most common species here. Sanderling. This is a high latitude breeder, and you guys probably, if you go to beaches, you recognize this species. A lot of people think these are snowy plovers, and I always hear, well, there's tons of these guys out there. How could they possibly be endangered? But you can see them really going in and out with the tide, right? So they're foraging on benthic fauna as well. And they're gone in the summertime because they're in the high Arctic to breed. And that's similar for the Whimbrell, which will largely be through here and by the end of this coming month to breed in the high Arctic. And then we have sort of the mid-interior latitude breeders like the willet, marble godwit, and the Longboat Curley. And from some work that we did a really long time ago, this gives you an idea of how many shorebirds occur per linear kilometer of sandy beach in Monterey Bay. And that number might not be super significant out of context, but you can see sort of what the common species are with Sanderling kind of making up the numerical bulk. If you're looking at the bigger species like willets and marble godwits, in terms of biomass, those would be ranking a little bit higher. And then in terms of how does this compare across the state, this is a pretty high number. And so now I want to just move into the section where I'm going to talk a little bit about snowy plovers. Oh wait, I have to point out that this is Blake Matheson photo, which I just leave the room. Good timing. Which is one of the most beautiful photos that I have in my collection, and I use it all the time. Thanks, Blake. And so this gives you an idea of what the Pacific Coast population looks like. So the Pacific Coast population of the Western Snowy Plover was federally listed as threatened in 1993. So it's been a while, and then you can see the sort of recent population trajectory. What I don't have on here, I don't think, no I don't, is that the population target for this species to be delisted is 3,000 birds, which is right at the top of the vertical axis there. So even though the population has increased from historic levels, especially from when it was listed in 1993, which is off the graph here to the left, we haven't really made many strides in the last, say, 10 or so years. And so progress towards recovery has stalled. Oh, there's the population goal, okay. To talk a little bit about snowy plover ecology, the habitat requirements of the plover, this is an aerial view of Salinas River National Wildlife Refuge looking inland at the Salinas River. This is very typical habitat, open dunes. If you're a plover flying by, this looks like a pretty good place to nest. Low disturbance, extensive areas to forage. Similarly, this is Moss Landing State Beach and then Moss Landing Wildlife Area in the back there, and you can see adjacent to Elkhorn Slough, those tidal ponds, or those muted tidal ponds are former salt production ponds, and they're an important habitat for snowy plovers in Monterey Bay as well. And their foraging ecology, this is really similar to what we've just looked at for all those other species. They're visual predators. They have a huge amount of their brain devoted to vision because they spot prey and run and grab it, as compared to sandpipers, which are tactile foragers. And they insert their bills into the sand and sort of feel for prey and then pull it out in a sort of tactile way. And the life history characteristics that make the snowy plover really unique in the shorebird world is that they nest in temperate latitudes. And as I kind of went over with the more common species here in winter and in migration, very few shorebirds remain in temperate latitudes to nest. So it's an interesting life history strategy, and it's also one of the things that makes them very vulnerable to human disturbance. They have sequential pair bonds throughout the season. It's a very long breeding season, and they will mate and produce young and then mate with someone else and produce a second set of young typically. And I'll talk a little bit more about these things. The young are precocial, which means they leave the nest pretty quickly after they hatch, within a few hours. And they rely on what we call crypsis and camouflage, which are essentially the same type of thing, to blend into the environment. And you can see that those eggs look like sand, the chicks look like sand, the male looks like sand. That's part of how they avoid predators. And so has anybody here ever seen one of my talks before? Okay, good. Because this is kind of fun. I like to do this. This is the audience participation. Does everybody see the nest here? Okay, good. Yeah, so it's right here. And it shows you that if you're just walking by, you might not notice it. And so amidst the little bit of vegetation there. And then do people see the chicks? Well, there they are. 1, 2, 3 chicks, which is a typical clutch. And then, okay, are you guys ready for the final exam question? How many adults? Okay, so I hear people murmuring 3, which is correct, so good for you. Good observers. 1, 2, a bird doing a lure display there with its tail down, and 3. And if you kind of take a step back and think about that photo without the yellow circles, those birds look like tiny pieces of driftwood, which is how they've been designed by evolution to just blend in. And so much so that they're hard even for experienced biologists to see. So I want to talk a little bit about reproduction. I mentioned it's a lengthy breeding season. These birds breed from March all the way through September, and they mate multiple times. There's been so many times in my career that I've wondered why I decided to study a bird with such a long breeding season. Why did I not study Arctic shorebirds that go for 8 weeks and then are done? But it enables them the possibility of producing many young. And so that's the advantage, that's the life history advantage to staying in temperate latitudes. You have other factors that you have to deal with, but because the weather is, amiable, they're able to pursue that strategy. So the female obviously lays the eggs, which are a considerable portion of her body weight, and that's typical of birds that have precocial young. They're making a big investment in that egg, so the chick is really big, and sort of when it hatches, it's ready to go. It takes about a month for the chick of incubation for the chicks to hatch, and then it takes about a month of rearing, and we'll look at a bunch of photos of rearing. But for these females, the total clutch, 20%, I have it here, 20% of female body weight. And so imagine, for the ladies in the room, do some math and imagine what it would be like to give birth to a child that was 20% of your body weight, twice in 6 months. And so that's sort of the female's role. She's doing a lot of that, and then the male is going to rear the chicks. And sometimes they get really excited about lining their nests, overly excited, as you can see right there. But it's good protection against the blowing wind. I mentioned they're highly precocial. These chicks here, these chicks are, you know, probably a few days old at the most. Incubation doesn't start until all 3 eggs are laid, so that when the eggs hatch, they hatch synchronously, and that's an anti-predator adaptation, so that within a few hours of all the chicks hatching synchronously, they leave the nest synchronously, and they feed themselves. So if you think about things like robins, songbirds, birds in that group, warblers, all the things that people like to go out and look at, those birds are fed at the nest by the parents, often both parents, for a long period of time. These chicks go out and start foraging on their own within hours of hatching, which is really, truly remarkable. And so I have a sequence of photos here that's kind of neat to look at. So the female will stay at the nest for the first usually for the first few hours after the chicks hatch. She's kind of done her job, so here's a female at the nest with her chick. And then usually within anywhere from the first few hours to, you know, the first half day, the male will take over, and he's the dad. And this is a really common care strategy in the shorebird kingdom. I have some videos here which I hope will work. Let me just try this, but if they do work, this is just a kind of a neat view of a male at the nest with his chicks right after they hatch. That's part one. And then
is that just wind?
Yeah, that's just the sound of the wind. And that's like and waves. It's not a windy day. And so you saw the male take the shell away, so another anti-predator thing. You don't want to leave shells lying around. And here's part 2. So if you read about the snowy plover call, that's the terwheat call, which is an alarm call, and I think also a call to the chicks to get it together, come back. And so I mentioned the anti-predator behavior in that one, the armchair biologist slide of where you guys got to count the adults. So this is the lure display, and this is what often either parent bird will do. If you find yourself on a beach and a bird is doing this, you're probably really close to either a nest or chicks. And we call it a lure display, and they'll do it to sort of attract you away from the nest. And then the male's a single parent, as I mentioned, and he mostly takes the chicks to places that he thinks are good areas to feed. And usually males maintain chicks in a territory that's usually around the nest, where the nest was, but not always. Sometimes he'll move them long distances to get to an area, or because of something that happens, like say a peregrine moves in, well, you definitely maybe want to move away from that. But it's to his advantage to know his area, to know the human disturbance patterns, to know the predator patterns, to know where the rack is, to understand how the tide comes up the beach. So males are very, very site faithful to their territories, and they'll nest in the pretty much same, 50 square meters every year if the conditions are good. The chicks get highly mobile. These chicks are, maybe a weekish old, and you can see how long their legs are and how fast they run. They tend to hang out in a dispersed way, which is also sort of anti-predator, so if something comes in, they're not all right in the same place. And this is a recently fledged fledgling, so they reach fledging in about 4 weeks from that little tiny cotton ball. They're about the size of a cotton ball when they hatch, to this size, which is about 40 grams. It's still a really small bird. But just from eating kelp flies, it's pretty amazing. It's a really nutritious food, and they'll start flying, and they will be flying from that point on. But of course, they're really vulnerable when they're not flying, pre-flight. And then I mentioned this sort of sequential pairing. Meanwhile, the female, as soon as those chicks are out of the nest and off with the male, she'll go find a new male and start over again, which is really remarkable. Sometimes dispersing to new sites, but definitely dispersing away from the territory that the male will rear the chicks in. We have an unequal sex ratio in the population here in Monterey Bay, so there's slightly more males than females, which facilitates the females going and finding a new mate, and often those second mates are juveniles, so they will be nesting with an experienced, so juvenile first-year male, be nesting with an experienced female for their first nest, which helps them learn about what they're supposed to do. So this is that same photo, and there's males sort of coming in to say, hey, are you ready to go? Because it looks like you're ready to pair with someone else. Sometimes males will hang around a nest that's hatching because they know that the female is going to become available. It's interesting. Right, and so it's essentially, we call it serial polygamy. It's not necessarily monogamy because they don't mate with the same individual every year, but often the first nests of the year are with the same mate. So birds will return to the same spot, say Pajaro River, nest with the same first mate, and then whatever happens after that is sort of catch as catch can. And so the causes of population decline for snowy plovers in Monterey Bay and really throughout the range of the listed Pacific Coast population, and I didn't mention what that range was. It's really sandy beaches of the Pacific Coast, so southern Washington all the way down to the Mexico border. Of course, the habitat continues into Mexico, but not part of the US listed population. So predators, human-caused disturbance, landscape change, what we call stochastic events, which are random or chance events, and then any intrinsic population processes, and that's things like genetic, inbreeding, small populations no longer being viable. Those things are in parentheses because those are not really the primary drivers of decline of this species. Or they were not the primary drivers of decline, but when you get a population to a small enough size, those things can become significant. So a little more on each of those things. The predators that are problematic for snowy plovers are, fall into sort of these broad categories. We have non-native predators like the red fox, which was introduced for hunting and for fur farming. And then we have native enhanced populations of predators, which are sometimes called subsidized predators or synanthropic predators because they do so well with humans. And corbids, meaning crows, ravens, and also even jays, are examples of subsidized predators that really occur in much higher numbers because of what humans have done to alter the landscape. And then we have other rare species like the northern harrier and the peregrine falcon, which are respectively California species of special concern and a formerly federally listed species that's now been delisted for recovery. And so there can be some conflicts there when you have one listed species preying on another listed species. I want to talk a little bit more about corbids, ravens and crows in particular. This data that you can see on this plot here is from Christmas bird counts. So if you all do Christmas bird counts, you're contributing to long-term data sets like this, which is great. This obviously doesn't go through present, but these trends in ravens and also there's not a good guide here. It's two different data sets. This is true for crows too. Corvids in the western United States are an exponential population growth, and they're vastly overpopulated to what they would have been in historic levels. They are significant depressors of many listed species populations, including in the Intermountain West, sage grouse, in the Mojave Desert, desert tortoise, beach nesting birds, California least terns, snowy plovers, forest nesting marbled murrelets. And these are the species we know about. So they have similar impacts on other species. It's just that those other species aren't being as heavily monitored. Significant predator of eggs for the snowy plover in this region and everywhere else along the Pacific coast. I talked about human disturbance. This is just one example. This includes snowy plovers and other shorebirds in winter. And these are just flight distances for different types of disturbances. And you can see that way over close to the vertical axis, we have things like kite surfers, which are a picture of there, really look a lot like avian predators. So that type of activity is potentially something that will cause a plover not to no longer nest at a beach that it might have formerly nested at. An example of that in Santa Cruz County is Waddell Creek. We used to have plovers nesting there, and it just became a huge kite surfing, wind surfing, things in the air kind of place. No longer have plovers nesting there. Could also note that dogs off leash that are greater than a meter from handler was the other sort of big category, horses as well. So things that are sort of threatening. And then there's some things, this is from Oceano Dunes, which is a vehicle area, and so there's amazingly things like moving vehicles they're very habituated to, which is also actually quite dangerous for them. And then landscape change is a really big one. Dockweiler Beach, Los Angeles County. Doesn't look very appealing for if you're wildlife. Amazingly, plovers have nested here for the first time in, I think, the last 60 years, about 2 to 3 years ago, because there was some habitat restoration that was done on this beach. But much of the historic range of the snowy plover is Central and Southern California, where the whole coastal strand in Fort Dune has just been obliterated by development. And some of the beaches have actually been augmented with sand nourishment, so they historically weren't even this big. So of the historic sites that snowy plovers occupied, they're absent from more than 50% of those sites. And they've come back to a few. They've come back a little bit here, Malibu Lagoon. There's a few little sort of exciting success stories, but I think you can tell from looking at this landscape that this will never be a functioning, intact ecosystem. And then I already mentioned climate change. A really big one for us here is sea level rise. This is Pajaro Dunes in Santa Cruz County, and it's a classic coastal squeeze. You can see the riprap there. Sea level rise is going to cause accelerating erosion. The beach levels will drop, and pretty soon you won't be able to walk across these beaches. There's probably many examples y'all can think of right here. The Harbor House condos, I don't know what I guess it's called the Tides Hotel now. I always call it the Monterey Beach Hotel, which tells you how old I am. Where at certain tides you can't get by. And so we will lose access to these beaches. They will become subtidal over time without shoreline retreat happening. And we just don't have that really well mapped out yet, although there are lots of people that are starting to think about it and work on that. So I want to talk a little bit about our project now, which started really in the late 70s, but became sort of more formalized in the early 80s. You can actually see the range of the nesting range of the snowy plover there on the map. So of course we're here in Monterey Bay, where our project is based. We have a big collaboration of landowners and other partners here that work on this project. The two big things we do are reproductive and population monitoring, and then with partners, habitat and predator management. And when we talk about monitoring, we're talking about locating nests and determining the fate of nests. We ban chicks to determine fledging status. To some degree, we ban adults so that we can monitor their demographic rates, their survival, their dispersal, et cetera. And just as an example, in 2022, we documented 327 nesting attempts. We banded 165 chicks and 8 adults. And since 1984, we've banded more than 15,000 chicks and adults across the years. With snowy plovers, because they are elusive, documenting fledgling success is very difficult to do without banded chicks. We used to band a lot more chicks than we do now. Right now we're banding about 50% of the chicks that hatch per year in Monterey Bay. And so what types of data does monitoring produce? So this is our long-term data set, and you can see the percentage of all clutches that hatched in the blue there, and then the percentage of chicks that fledged. Lots of annual variability, and you can see that our last year, 2021, was actually not as bad as some of the more recent years, but I think if you just kind of blur your eyes, you can see that this trend is not going up, and it's not even actually terribly level. And so there's a lot of reasons for that, most of which I've already covered. But in more recent years within the main part of Monterey Bay, corvids and especially ravens have been just a massive limiting factor here. So we've learned some other things from our monitoring. We've learned what annual survival is. Males survive at a slightly higher rate than females, possibly because of the demands of egg laying, possibly because of other things that we don't quite understand. First year survival is lower, as it typically is in most bird species. Average lifespan is not very long, so another reason to have a nice long breeding season, because if you don't live very long, you need to get your young out while you can. And then I think that I need to update this. I think the maximum age that's been documented in the Pacific Coast now is 16 years, and that's of course from our banding studies. So it's a pretty long life for a little bird. And then the most successful male in our population in his 12-year lifespan fledged 34 young, which is remarkable. And I had the privilege of monitoring this male for most of his life. It's not this bird here. This was our longest lived female. And you can see our color banding scheme there. That bird is yellow, red, green, yellow. So they can produce a lot of young in their lifespan. And that's part of what has kept the population afloat. If you look at the Atlantic coast, there's a very similar species there called the piping plover. They're monogamous. They might re-nest if they lose a clutch. They don't have the very long breeding season. And so the plovers on the Pacific coast have a little bit more of an advantage that way. And so we've learned some things about dispersal patterns as well, and this is really important for conservation. That's a juvenile plover right there. So you can see the light scalloping on the head and the edges of the body feathers. That shows you that it's a juvenile plumage. And one of the things that we've learned is that that arrow is going from Monterey Bay-ish, San Francisco Bay area to not very far. We've learned that we have what's called a pretty structured metapopulation. So the vast majority of natal dispersals, so young birds going somewhere else to nest for their first year, they hatch here, they fledge here, and they're like, okay, I'm gonna go find my place, are gonna not disperse very far. The vast majority are going to disperse within 50 to 75 kilometers of their natal sites. And this is true throughout most of the range. But then there's this other pattern in which birds that are on the end of the range tend to disperse longer distances. And this is not that uncommon in birds. But what we know from the structured metapopulation is that, for example, the plovers that are produced down in San Diego County, by and large, are not going to repopulate the Monterey Bay population if Monterey Bay was to go be extirpated, or we had an oil spill and all the birds here died, and vice versa. And so that's really important. So we have a series of kind of units along the coast, which mostly interchange with the units that are near them, with some exceptions. And so a lot of what we do is management of these anthropogenic or human-caused stressors on the population, which really all of the stressors the plover faces are mostly human-caused. And these are the sorts of things that we've done over the timeline of the species. There's the listing right there. So habitat restoration has been something that's been going on prior to even the plover being listed. We've used single nest exclosures. We've managed mammalian predators, used broad habitat fencing, those cable fences that you see on the beaches that we'll see a photo of in a second. Management of avian predators. Once the population recovered a little bit, then avian predators became an issue. Because by and large, those species were recovering a little bit as well. Domestic dogs, at least on California state parks within Monterey Bay, are by and large prohibited on nesting beaches. And then much more recently, corvids, crows and ravens, have been managed. And when I'm talking about management here, I'm talking about lethal removal for corvids. And so these things have all been critical to even maintaining the plover population at the level that it's at right now. And if you look at the causes of nest loss over time, you can see, these are the causes of, total causes of nest loss. So this is not just predator losses. This is the proportion of all losses caused by predators sort of clumped into mammals and avian. And you can see that there are some losses to mammals, and it's typically striped skunks, which are voracious little guys, and they'll go out, and they don't cover huge distances. The bulk of our identified predation over time is avian predators, and the bulk of what you're seeing in there in orange is ravens. And I think, is this a, I don't know if I have I do have a video here. So this is Moss Landing Wildlife Area. This is a raven caught on a nest cam. And then this, I think, hopefully this will play. Ravens coming in to take some eggs. And this is what they typically do. And often they just take them and fly away. And we think that they detect plovers. Well, we don't think, we know, because we've seen them do it. They just fly this sort of pattern like this, and they flush them off the nest. And you could see these guys, when they flew in, they landed within inches of that nest, right? They're not landing and walking around and sort of ambiently looking for things. If you know anything about corvids, you know that they have giant campi. They're really good at spatial orientation, and so that's been a real problem for plovers. They travel over huge distances. They can forage over 20 miles in a day. And prior to 2007, they were not really present in coastal Monterey Bay. So in 07 and 08, they came in. We had actually a pretty robust recovering population at that point, and our population has declined since then, overall. So managing recreation on beaches, these are those cable symbolic fences. A lot of the beach out there has got this, quote, symbolic fencing, which is really not going to keep any people out. But it's the idea of this is to sort of delineate where the important habitat is for plovers and to sort of respectfully request that people stay out of these areas that are so sensitive. A side benefit of this is it's also really good for the landform, to not destroy the landform, which is really important for sea level rise. And you'll see these signs. Anywhere you go on the Pacific coast where plovers are nesting, you'll see informational signs. I mentioned earlier increasing human activity. This is the data that we collect. These are just encounter rates of humans per survey hours for the last 10 or so years, and that's increasing. And then also, you can look at the rates of dogs and off-leash versus on-leash. Everything's increasing. One important thing to point out about this is that most of the sites that are here that you see the data from, with very few exceptions, dogs are actually prohibited from these sites. So this is not people violating the leash law. This is people bringing dogs to beaches where they're not permitted. And this is a problem for plovers because it's chronic harassment. We have had over the past couple years the number of nests that have been actually depredated, so eaten by dogs, has gone up a little bit. And we had a biologist a couple years ago, last year and the year before, document dogs actually killing chicks on state beaches that they are prohibited from being on in the first place. And so the more people you have on the beach, it's not, I love dogs and horses and all animals, but it's sensitive habitat, and there's thresholds for what can be accommodated that's outside of what is, prescribed. And so I think for those of us who work with plovers, we think, okay, we've cabled off the fencing, the plovers are doing really well, they're nesting, they're putting their nests inside the fencing, which of course they don't always do. This is a shot from the COVID pandemic, and I just want to zoom in on it because you can see this area down here. This is the Sunset State Beach. This is the main day use area at Sunset State Beach. I don't know if any of y'all have ever been there, but this is a place where there's never nesting. This beach was closed during the 2020 year to all access except from very far, and it was actually patrolled to keep people out for the pandemic. And the plovers went bananas in this area. And so just in case we think that what we're cabling off for them is adequate and functioning, et cetera, they reminded us that it's not, and that they would be all over these outer beaches if they were allowed to be. So this, for me, as a biologist who's worked with the species for a really long time, was a good reminder that human activity on sandy beaches limits plover habitat use. And of course, restoration is really, really critical. It's a really important part of habitat management. This is a restored dune at Slings River State Beach. We're so lucky here in Monterey Bay to have so many natural dunes and so many restored dunes. And I'm sure you all have been to multiple different sites like this, but if you have not, I encourage you to go out and have that aha moment that I had when I was a student, when you realize that this is what a dune is supposed to look like. And I wanted to just give you sort of like the take home with plovers. So some of the bottom line here, this is for all of Recovery Unit 4, so this includes Monterey and a few other small populations to the north, Point Reyes National Seashore and a few little sites up there, but the 95% of the population's here in Monterey Bay. As a measure of population, we look at fledglings per male. So that's how many fledglings fledged in a given year per number of males in the population. It's just a basic replacement rate for population stability. And we want that number to be around 0.1. Well, if you look since about 2014, 2015, we haven't really approached that level, and we're sort of trending in the wrong direction. And a lot of that is coming from our inability to get nest to hatch because of ravens, and then once we do have chicks, it's hard to get them to fledge. And so this is our overall population number, and you can see where we are there. I don't know if I didn't put a marker in. So our target for Monterey Bay is right there at 350. And so we've met it in a lot of the recent years over the past 15 or so, or even 20 years, but the trends of late are not good. I hope that decline is going to start to stabilize. And this is really all about effective, management of these stressors that I was talking about. So we take all these actions to protect plovers, and a lot of people ask the question of, are they conservation reliant? And for now, they are. Without these actions, if beaches weren't cabled off, if we didn't manage predators and humans to some degree, plovers' nests would probably all be destroyed. There would be small remnant populations hanging on in more remote places within Monterey Bay. There are other sandy beach and dune beneficiaries of the type of management that we do for plovers. We do have some other nesting shorebirds here, like American avocets. We have black-necked stilts. There are multiple species of waterfowl that nest. And of course, we have our migratory and our wintering shorebirds that are here on the beaches that benefit from our recreation management. And then of course, there's rare dune flora like this Yaden's wallflower, of which there's only a couple populations extant in Monterey Bay. And so conservation of the larger ecosystem is really important. I will just take this moment, I hadn't planned on doing this, but to draw your attention to the CMEX mine site, which probably a lot of you are familiar with, which is scheduled to transfer into public ownership. It's a 400-acre coastal site here in Monterey Bay that is so critical for snowy plovers. And it's really critical that it is preserved in such a way that allows plovers to continue to nest there. I think it's fair and safe to say in this crowd that if there's too much human recreation, it will become degraded like all the rest of the sites in Monterey Bay. It's one of the most pristine remote sites left in the bay, and it's connected to the Slings National Wildlife Refuge. It's really critical, so we're obviously keeping a really close eye on that, and we do field work there all the time. But it's good to be on everybody else's radar here too. And then of course, kind of where I started is where I want to end. We want to build climate resiliency. The word resiliency gets put out there a lot, but the definition that I have here is the capacity to respond effectively to change, to adapt successfully to new and unforeseen conditions and circumstances. So with climate change, we talk a lot about no analog futures. We have a lot of forecasts of certain types of things, but there will be feedback loops of things that happen and that accelerate trends or things that are unpredicted. For example, one of the things that's happening in these hotter, drier years is we have a lot more people on the beach, and I think a lot of that's what's driving our increased use of beaches. And so we're really interested in taking actions that we can, whatever actions we can, to help beaches become more resilient. These bar-built river mouth areas this is the Pajaro River, we have one at the Salinas River, are really vulnerable areas, and they're really critical for plovers, and they're maintained through this kind of annual dynamic of natural disturbance that I mentioned at the outset. Some of the other work that we've done here looking at the Salinas River mouth, which is a very similar system, is we've actually taken these ideas and tried to codify them in a framework for snowy plovers, in which we've identified really specific strategies and actions that we can take in order to protect the environment, which is the beach dune ecosystem that snowy plovers depend on. We've also been able to identify through that project and a spatial analytic approach that we took, which is a GIS-based approach, what the most resilient sites in Monterey Bay are going to be. And that site I mentioned earlier, ding, 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 CMEX is going to be very important. It's going to be a very resilient site long into the future. And then we're really trying to also generate more interest in the sandy beach environment in general because of the red-headed stepchild factor and the fact that it's located between marine and terrestrial environments and doesn't really get the attention. I think because of rising sea levels, it's finally starting to get the attention that it deserves. One of the statewide projects we've been involved in is the Sandy Beaches module of the Marine Protected Area Decadal Assessment, so where we are looking at shorebirds and beach profiles relative to when MPAs were designated. We would love to expand that work to include more of Monterey Bay because of fishing when the original MPAs were designated. Most of the MPAs in this region are outside of the center of Monterey Bay, which are the most important areas for snowy plovers and other shorebirds in Monterey Bay. And I always get this question, and I don't have a great answer for what the average person can do. I think the fact that you all are here is one of the things that, every time I come to give a talk, it gives me hope to see how many people are interested in learning. I think for rising sea levels, we can try to keep reducing our carbon footprint. If you're able to get involved in dune restoration, whether it's in your, it's at Asilomar Beach, which is in your neck of the woods, or it's something a little further afield, there's so many opportunities to do that. Beach cleanup is so critical. We are seeing increasing rates of entanglement of plovers with microplastics because of their habit of foraging along the drift rack. That's where all the plastics accumulate. And we've had to respond to 6 different birds this year already to capture them and remove, plastic entanglements from them. So beach cleanup is critical.
What kind of plastic are you talking about?
It's usually invisible, like it's like polyfibers from like clothing. It's that type of thing. It's amazingly, and because they have this, scutellation on their legs, like they're little flying dinosaurs, right? So they have scales on their legs. These little tiny filaments will get stuck in the scutulations, and they can lose their foot, or worse, more of their leg. Amanda's here, and I know that some of you here are involved in the Plover Guardian program. That is so desperately needed at so many of our beaches. Our Point Blue biologists and our partners at State Parks and Fish and Wildlife we're out there monitoring, but we can't be out there obviously all the time. And it's so critical the time that we are out there, the amount of sort of protection we're able to do there by contacting people or bringing out law enforcement is really helpful. And then always advocating for beaches as important environments. I think that, one of the reasons we all love Monterey Bay is because of the amazing continuous sandy beach environment here, which you actually don't find in that many places, and also because it's largely undeveloped, especially compared to California to the south. So these are some things that you can do, and I would be very grateful for anything that you can contribute to any of these activities. If you want to learn more about the work we do at Point Blue, you can go to our webpage. It's pointblue.org, easy to remember, and look at our sandy beach and dune ecosystem work. Some of our publications, Climate Smart publications, are there to look at. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.